AbuKhalil is a Lebanese-American political scientist and has been a professor at California State Stanislaus since 1993. He earned his bachelor's and master's from the American University of Beirut and his PhD from Georgetown University. Renowned for his critical insights into Middle Eastern politics, AbuKhalil has authored several influential works, including the Historical Dictionary of Lebanon and the Battle for Saudi Arabia. Dr. AbuKhalil will be speaking about the Arabi-Israeli conflict and war on Gaza, but there will be time for a question and answer session after, so gather your thoughts and questions during this time, please. And finally, I just wanted to thank everyone for coming here and thank ASI for sponsoring this event. So that's it for me. So we could get started.
Okay.
Draw down your questions.
Good evening, everybody. To be honest with you, in last several weeks, I have not been able emotionally or even mentally to speak on the subject. I have canceled many podcast interviews of that sort and lectures even. There's a personal connection with the city of Fresno for me. I lived many years in Central Valley in Modesto and so on. And I've spoken on this campus before. I've spoken, in Merced and so on. So the area is important to me. Just this morning, the state of Israel suspected that a Hezbollah official was in a building in Beirut, central Beirut, in a place that is a mere 3 blocks from where I grew up, literally 3 blocks. A place where it is few buildings from where my maternal aunt lives in her 80s by herself. Suspected that there was a Hezbollah official, so they came with their fighter jets, American supply, and they flattened the building, crushing everybody underneath. Everybody. Tens of people were crushed to death. Scores were injured. There will be numbers in a headline in the New York Times without identifying the culprit. It will be said, a strike in Beirut killed 20 or 25. To me, this is a repetition of terrorism that occurred throughout my life by the state of Israel. In 1982, I was 22 years old. I was exactly in the place that is within walking distance from where Israel bombed today, and there were no PLO centers. There was no Hezbollah at the time. There was no Hamas in 1982. There was the PLO. And Israel and the United States were saying Israel's problem is only with the PLO. But there were no PLO around where I lived. Israel came, we heard roars of fighter jets, and suddenly the biggest explosion of my life I heard. And I'm somebody who grew up in the civil war of Lebanon, so explosions were commonplace. But this time it was something different entirely. I remember the only time of my life I wondered for several seconds, which felt like an eternity, whether I am alive or dead. Because I remember there was a thick ray of fire and dust traveling from one apartment. We live in apartment buildings in Lebanon, as you know, from one end of the house to the other end. And my mom was immediately on the floor. She lost consciousness, and all glass in the house were shattered. And it was an event that marked me for life. I was born in 1960 in Beirut, Lebanon. My father is from Tyre and my mother is from Beirut. But the Palestinian problem is as personal to me as it is to a Palestinian who was driven out of his or her homeland. Because I have seen firsthand the atrocities, the massacres that Israel inflicts on a regular basis on Arabs. But this is a project that is unsustainable. It is so rejected by its region and by its people that it requires such a repetition of mass violence unendingly, because they cannot survive without crushing the population that is bursting with rejection and desire against an upper-sized, racist, genocidal entity. The struggle for justice for Palestine is becoming more difficult for you here on college campus in the United States. Much more than ever. They are throwing their usual tricks, dismissing all our sentiments for equality and justice in the Holy Land, in Palestine, as being anti-Semitic. But unfortunately, they are hurting the cause of fighting real anti-Semitism by politicizing the term, thereby emptying it of its true meanings. They are the true anti-Semites because they are aligning themselves for the purpose of Israel with the most hateful groups in America and elsewhere. Neo-Nazis are on their side. Evangelical Christians who do not like Jews are on their side. By the way, I'm still waiting for the bottle of water, please.
That's right here.
Thank you. So, college students who are fighting for justice are now branded as terrorists. There was an article yesterday in the New York Times discrediting and stigmatizing the activists at Columbia University campus, almost naming them as terrorists. There is now the phenomenon of doxing. They want to make you unemployable. They want you to be expelled from your universities because you choose to stand out for the most difficult cause in the world today if you live in the West. If you live in the West. And I argue even if you live in the Arab world. Because in the Arab world we are under the tutelage of the most corrupt, despotic regimes in the Gulf that are running the region along with Israel and using their media, for those of you who know Arabic, Al-Arabiya and Hadath and all that, in the service of the Israeli war effort. The Arab world is not what it used to be. They are trying to Zionize our political culture. But the fight is worth it because it will lead to an ultimate victory. A victory that will establish for the first time since 1948 a place where Jews, Muslims and Christians and anybody else can live in equality. Not in apartheid, not in segregation, not under the threat of genocide, not with a history that is an anthology of massacres and war crime. In my own lifetime, before there was Hezbollah or Hamas, Israel in my lifetime bombed the following countries: Tunisia, Egypt, Sudan, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Palestine, and of course downed civilian airliners. They downed one in Lebanon in 1950, they downed one in Libya in 1973. Scores of terrorism around the world, scores of terrorist acts. They introduced terrorism into our region. They did. I often cite a chronology of when terrorism was first introduced in our region. I will read you the record. They have made us Arabs and Muslims as terrorists. In reality, our region did not know terrorism before the advent of Zionism into our world. Zionism knew that the native population was not going to submit, was not going to give up its homeland, and it's going to fight. It's been fighting for over a century in order to stay on its land and to restore its right and to establish justice. I cannot believe how much I tweet. I can't find it from yesterday. Okay, if somebody can find it on my Twitter from yesterday, it's headlined, "Who are the terrorists?" And please hand it to me while I continue. Anyway, so for somebody like myself, growing up under the threat of Israeli bombing, the notion that Israel is engaged in self-defense is totally unpalatable. Imagine living in a country where the people of the left, like Bernie Sanders, people who speak about peace and justice, like Bernie Sanders, will tell me that Israel is engaged in self-defense even when it kills 42,000 Palestinians, mostly women and children. Bernie Sanders has not spoken on what's happening in Lebanon, where over 2,500 people have been killed in 2 weeks. In 1982, when Israel invaded Lebanon, during the time when it bombed my neighborhood, They managed to kill 20,000, mostly civilians, Lebanese and Palestinians, in a matter of few weeks, also under the title of self-defense. A country today like Israel is engaged simultaneously in the bombing of Lebanon, Yemen, Palestine, Syria, and Iraq, all at the same time, all in the name of self-defense. And of course Iran, they also bombed Iran. I mean, imagine when you know the facts and you are sitting in America and they are lying to you. They are lying to you on purpose, because one of the enemies of the Zionist movement, the biggest enemies of the Zionist movement, is basically the facts. And the facts of history are on the side of the Palestinians. By the way, anything I will say here today, anything, you can ask me for a footnote when I'm done or email me later. The conflict is not complicated. The conflict is not complex. Whenever they say that to you on TV in America, they are lying to you, because they want to camouflage the facts. They want you not to look for the simple facts of history. Jews and Arabs lived together for hundreds of years in the Middle East. Unlike their plight in Europe. In Europe, Jews suffered from horrific anti-Semitism. In the 14th century, they were expelled from France en masse. In British history, over several centuries, they would decide to kick Jews out of their land. In the Middle East, it wasn't like that in the Arab world. They were thriving in Morocco, they were thriving in Alexandria, they were thriving in Beirut, in Aleppo, in Baghdad. They were living there. They were living there in Yemen in conditions of poverty. But the notion that we had anti-Semitism like in Europe, it's absolutely not the case. And this is why the Palestinians are very frustrated. They feel they have been punished in Palestine for a crime that they did not commit. A crime that was perpetrated by European Christians. Christianity, the church itself, sheltered anti-Semitism and agitated against Jewish people. It is not the Palestinians. It's not the Arabs who lived as brothers and sisters among Jews. Our family summer home in the mountains of Lebanon was purchased by a Jewish merchant who was friend with my maternal grandfather. People lived together. On Saturday, during the Shabbat, the Jews, neighbors of my mother's family, would ask them to help them during the household for chores that they could not do as Orthodox Jews. And then Zionism came to our region. It is true there was a problem of anti-Semitism throughout Europe. And then there was a search for a place where Jews can have a haven to live in peace, something they deserve. But it shouldn't have been at the expense of another population. And that's exactly what the Palestinian problem is about. And European Zionists did not care about the native Palestinians, because the movement was from the beginning a racist, colonialist movement. It came out of Europe. And they sold the movement to European racists and bigots and anti-Semites as a colonialist project. The founder of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, spoke about creating an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism of Asia. They spoke that racist language. Racism is not a side story of Zionism. It is at the core of what Zionism is about. How can you justify the creation of a state by immigrants who had absolutely no roots in the land over centuries, unlike the Arabs who were living there? And Jews were living in the land as well, of course. But the numbers were mostly Muslims and Christians, and Jews lived among them and worshipped like Muslims and Christians. You cannot justify that project unless, just like slavery, just like apartheid South Africa, unless you believe and you inculcate your people with the belief that those are inferior. They are not like us. Do you believe that the murder, the slaughter of 42,000 Palestinians at least over 1 year, to the silence of the West, could have happened if there is no fundamental contempt for the native population, they don't believe they are human beings. That's why Israel could kill of them as many as they want. I am now, after 1 year, certain that if Israel were to drop a nuclear weapon on Gaza or Lebanon, American establishment and Bernie Sanders would find excuses, would justify it. There will be no uproar because they are Muslims and Arabs, even though many of them are Christians, of course. They don't count. Just yesterday, Israel destroyed a church. You don't hear about that. You don't hear protests about that by evangelical Christians who claim to care about Christians of the Middle East. It doesn't fit with their story, with their narrative. So, from the beginning, the founders wanted to create a state by force. Theodor Herzl actually said that. He was asked, how are you going to be able to create a state against the wish of the population? He said in French, "Que veut la fin veut les moyens." Who desires the end desires the means. They were blatant. Initially, Theodor Herzl, in his book, Der Judenstaat, in German for the State of the Jews, even though the book is mistranslated in your library as the Jewish state, because it should be translated the State of the Jews, because at that time he did not care where it's going to be. He actually, as a chapter in that book, says Argentina or Palestine. They were looking around, wherever Europeans going to give them a piece of land. But then when he was going around in 1897, East European Jews said, we will not agree to the movement unless you confine it to the Holy Land. And that's what was decided. And the first aim of the Zionist movement in the declaration of 1897 was the colonization of Palestine. And you knew they were going to use it by force. And they started mistreating the population immediately. Immediately. And by the 1930s, their numbers grew because Palestine was under the tutelage of the British Mandate government, which was committed to the Balfour Declaration. And the Balfour Declaration in 1917, November 2nd, promised a homeland already inhabited to European Jews, basically. The letter was addressed to, Balfour Declaration was addressed to Lord Rothschild. And they committed Britain to the establishment of a Jewish home in Palestine. The Palestinians are not mentioned in that declaration. They were 91% of the population. You know what they called them in that declaration? Non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Imagine if I refer to American people as those of you who are not Arab Americans. You know, that's how the Palestinians were referred to. They were not the term of reference. And what did the declaration give them? They were promised religious and civil rights, not political rights. So the inhabitants were denied political right 1917, and the immigrants were promised political rights. From the beginning, the project had to be done violently. By the 1930s, the Palestinians engaged in a mass revolt. Why did they revolt? One, they discovered in the port of Jaffa at the time a importation by the Zionists of mass barrels of weapons, arms, to use against the native population. Two, they were buying land and kicking out the peasants. In the past, when ownership of land changed hand, the peasant remained on the land. They were not affected by the sale of lands. This time, the new owners kicked them out of the land. They came from rural countryside to the cities, and they were faced with what's called Hebrew labor, meaning all Jewish enterprises did not want to employ Arabs, so they were unemployed. Three, the number of Jewish immigrants was increasing without the consent of the local population, because that was the decision by Britain, racist, anti-Semitic Britain, even though Balfour himself was anti-Semite. Winston Churchill, as you know, was committed Zionist, was also a racist, openly, blatantly so. Who authorized the use of chemical weapons in Iraq in the 1920s? Lord Balfour complained about Jews in 1905 in his speech in the House of Commons. Read about that in the book, The Balfour Declaration by Leonard Stein. So in response to all the threat around them, the Palestinians erupted in revolt. What is called Intifada, which has been turned into a world of terrorism. And during that time of the 1930s was when Zionists first introduced what we know as terrorism that had been associated with the Middle East. Long before there was PLO, Hassan Nasrallah was not even born, nor was Hamas created. What did they use? Tossing grenades in crowded markets, using barrel bombs against civilians. You've heard about it in the Syrian war like it's never been used before. The horror of the Western media. The Zionists used it in order to destroy Jaffa, to create what is called Tel Aviv now, and the greater Tel Aviv. They started throwing bombs in buses, in cars, booby-trapping ambulances, car bombs, truck bombs, sniping at civilians, letter bombs, bombing of embassies. Every single terrorist act you think about where the media associate with Arabs and Muslims was used by Zionists in the 1930s. And they want to brand the Arab population when they resist their aggression as terrorists. They are in no position to lecture or to pontificate on that subject. The Palestinian revolt failed. The odds were against them. The other side was heavily armed, supported by Western powers. Western powers that were anti-Semitic. They wanted to get rid of the Jewish population and send them over there. They didn't care about Jewish population. Even FDR, he knew about the Holocaust. He was given location of the rain tracks to bomb, to prevent the expulsion of Jews and shipping them into the concentration camps, and he didn't take any action. Even immigration, they were not allowing more than 3,000 or 4,000 Jewish refugees into the United States. In 1947, the United Nations General Assembly came up with an idea. Let's partition the land. In 1917, the Arabs were 91% of the population, and they owned bulk of the land. The Jews owned like 2% or 3% of the land. By 1947, with the support of Britain, the Jewish segment of the population grew in size. It became like a third. But the ownership of the land were less than 7-8%. And they said the land, which was Palestinian, would be partitioned. The Jewish segment would be 55%. The Palestinians would get 41%. Jerusalem would be an international city. To this day I hear liberals in America and elsewhere saying, if only the Palestinians accepted that partition. Why shouldn't they have? Why would they have? Why would they have agreed to any abandonment of their homeland? Their centuries old homeland. They refuse, and good for them, on matter of principle. Palestinians have proven with their blood how attached they are to their homeland, and they won't give it up. Imagine Zionism had been inflicting violence on them for over a century, and they don't give in or give up. Look what they've done with Gaza. Look at the footage. You don't see them rising up against Hamas. They're rising up against Israel. They know their enemy and its supporters in the West. The West has never revealed its ugly face more than last year, because at least people of the world know there is no left, right, or center. They are all equally bigoted and racist, willing to tolerate the mass slaughter of people just because they are not like you, because they're not white. They think they're all Muslims, of course. They don't know that many of them are Christians. And that's what explains this tolerance of what happened over the last year, with Israel launching all this seven-front war around against everybody, and having the gall to say they are remaking the Middle East. They are changing it into a better place. Amazing how every Israeli massacre every invasion is justified as an experiment in political reconfiguration supported by the United States. But this administration has been the worst since my lifetime. My lifetime. Ronald Reagan was a staunch supporter of Israel. Staunch supporter. Compared to Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, I would say Ronald Reagan was Hamas. Ronald Reagan actually used to look at slaughtered pictures, slaughtered children in Beirut of 1982, and used to call the prime minister, rebuking him on these deaths. In his diary, he referred to it as a Holocaust. Joe Biden, that racist quibbled with the number of Palestinians dead. Remember that? After 1 month, when 10,000 of them were killed, he quibbled with the number. He said, can't be that many. Later on, his State Department Near East official said, we believe the number are actually higher. And they are higher. Thousands of children are missing in Gaza because they're under the rubble. In the building that was flattened today in Beirut, there are people under the rubble. And you know what Israel has done in Beirut? If people try to rescue the survivors, they bomb them. This is a state that is self-righteous by virtue of American support to the extent that it doesn't believe morality applies to it, or international law, or ethics. You've heard of, at the latest crime, they manufactured 5,000 pagers that were imported into Lebanon. They booby-trapped them. Bin Laden never thought of that. 5,000 booby-trapped communication devices. And other thousands of walkie-talkies. They sent them to Lebanon and detonated them, killing many civilians. They don't care. And American media marveled at that terrorist technique. Of course, they didn't call it terrorist at all. During the Civil War, which was largely ignited by Israel, which supported the death squads in the Civil War, the Phalange, the fascists and the Nazis of Lebanon, they armed them. They created militias to fight against Palestinians and massacre them. During that war, we now know Israel was sending car bombs, truck bombs, and booby-trapped donkeys, donkey bombs. They would put bombs on a donkey, send it to Lebanon, and they would detonate them. We know that from a book by an Israeli with close ties to the army and intelligence. His name is Ronen Bergen. It's called Rise to Kill. What a title to speak about Israel, huh? Rise to Kill. It was ravely reviewed in the New York Times. He is actually now a New York Times writer, correspondent. We learned about that in that book. When I was in Lebanon, we used to notice these car bombs in the middle of our neighborhoods. And every time there was a car bomb, there was a group that would call a radio station and say, this was done by a Lebanese group called the Front for the Liberation of Lebanon from Foreigners. For long we assumed it was a Lebanese group that was doing all that. Only recent years, last 4 years, we learned this was Israel, using a fictitious name to justify these car bombs, truck bombs, and donkey bombs. That's the record of Israel that we lived through. What Israel is doing is not new. Been happening. In 1948, Israel, according to American history books, declared its independence. No! It was committing massacres months before. It was not satisfied with 55% of a homeland in which they owned less than 7-8%. They wanted it all, but they took only 78%. They left 22%. You hear, what about these Arab armies that invaded, tried to... I wish they did. I wish they did invade and prevent this horrific catastrophe from taking place, from expelling ethnocide of the Palestinians, expelling them out of their land. But they didn't. These governments were clients of the British. And they didn't put a good fight or a serious fight. I mean, just think that the Lebanese army went. I mean, that tells you the extent of the seriousness of Arab armies going to help the Palestinians. Israel was victorious, and you get the impression in America there were 7 Arab armies versus poor little Israel. In reality, at the height of the war, there were 3-1 in favor of the Israeli army, which was supported by the British, supplied by the British, trained by the British. Because during the Second World War, Britain allowed them to have their own army. While it was taking away hunting rifles from Palestinians from the 1930s. You can read list of the confiscation of Arab weapons from the 1930s in the book by Walid Khalidi, From Haven to Conquest. Israel became victorious. The Palestinians were kicked out. Something like 700,000 of them were kicked out. Israel allowed a token number to live there to say that here we are, Jews and Arabs living together. Of course, they were living as third-class citizens. They were kept under military rule until 1966, and to this day, their status is third and fourth-class citizens. Do you know Palestinians are now taken if they put a like on Facebook? If you celebrate the victory of your people, you go to jail. This is so-called the only democracy of the Middle East. It is the only fake democracy of the Middle East. It is the only fake rape and fake democracy of the Middle East. I say rape because do you know over the last year there are debates in the Knesset of Israel and in the media about rape of Palestinian prisoners. It is legitimately debated. Is it a good method or a bad method? And people like give speeches and arguments. Yeah, I think raping Palestinian prisoners is a really good thing. We can use broomsticks and so on. And that's the kind of discourse taking place in that state. And since 1948, that state has not stopped its record of frequent and regular massacres and war crimes. Didn't stop. Against all the neighbors, intervening in all Arab affairs. Call me conspiratorial, but I can give you an example if you ask me. Every civil war in my lifetime, Israel was a party to it. In Morocco, in the Western Sahara, it supported the brutal monarchy of King Hassan. And in 1966, helped kill a secular socialist opposition leader when he was kidnapped in France, Mahdi bin Baraka. It helped the Sudanese civil war on the side of the South. Was a midwife to the creation of the Republic of South Sudan. It was active in the Lebanese civil war. It was active with the Kurds rebellion. It was active in the Omani rebellion in 1970s. In September 1970 in Jordan, it was working against the Palestinians. Every country I can think of where there was a civil war or disturbances, Israel was a party to it. Yemen, of course. In the last decade, Yemen civil war, Israel was also helping the Saudis. In the 1960s, that's when the first contact between the Saudis and the Israelis, helping to crush a progressive Republican revolt against the traditional, conservative, obscurantist monarchy of Yemen. That's the record. Don't believe them when they tell you Arabs have a problem with Israel because they don't like Jews. It has nothing to do with that. If Israel was founded by Indonesian Muslims, we would feel as strongly about it. It has nothing to do with their religion. And we should also, in the pro-Palestine movement, stay vigilant against any manifestation of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism does not belong to our movement. Our movement is too just, too lofty, too ideal, too great to allow anti-Semites to creep into it. We should reject them, root them out. Anti-Semites belong with them, with Zionists, who have aligned themselves with anti-Semites around the world. Look at Elon Musk, clearly an anti-Semite. Wrote things that are clearly anti-Semitic. Trump has written things that are anti-Semitic. As long as you support Israel, your anti-Semitism would be forgiven. Look how they are making allies with neo-Nazis and new rights of Europe. As long as they support Israel, they don't mind their prejudice and their bigotry and their anti-Semitism. These are difficult times. Many of us have emotional, personal ties to the place that is being bombarded every single day. And worse, if you witness, I spent the whole summer in Lebanon, came a few weeks ago. When you witness it from here, it's even more difficult. I mean, I stopped watching TV news 20 years ago, but I have to read the newspapers. I mean, I teach political science, it's my homework. But it's not an easy one. You read them with clenched teeth. They lie to your face. They tell you things you know it's not the case. They call an entire area of a city where 300,000 people live Hezbollah stronghold. Hezbollah stronghold. Imagine if Arabs were to call a city where Jews live Israeli terrorist stronghold. That's a justification for the slaughter of civilians, which is exactly what Israel is doing with the United States. But you have more of a responsibility here in America to stand up against this genocide and the war of aggression, because it is not an Israeli war. It is a joint American-Israeli war. America is a close partner of what's happening. There are American troops helping in the genocide, supplying Israel with intelligence. Of course, they supply the money to kill Arabs and the bombs that kill Arabs. Israel has tossed more bombs on Gaza, one of the most smallest, highest concentration of a population than the Second World War, without any outrage in the West. Where's the outrage? College campus movements have died down. I hate to say, but that's the case, because they clamped down, they intimidated them. I know from my friend at Columbia, it's like a prison. Nobody can enter the buildings anymore unless you have to show your ID. And when people protest now, they cover their faces. And it's supposed to be the land of the free and the home of the brave. People are afraid to showing their faces in protest, because there are billionaires who are willing to put your picture and phone number and your home address on a big truck and parade it around your neighborhood, and contact law firms to not hire you when you finish law school. That's what they are doing. And their biggest enemy is freedom of speech. This is why I maintain the biggest enemy of free speech in the West is Zionism. They don't want free speech. Look at the debate about TikTok. They are furious that the young generation is more pro-Palestinian disproportionately here in America and elsewhere than pro-Israeli. It's generational. Young people are far more pro-Palestinian. Why? Because they don't read the New York Times. They don't watch CNN. They get the news directly from people on TikTok, some of whom are sending videos live from Gaza. You wouldn't see this footage here in American television, but you cannot escape them on social media. And this is why Facebook and Meta company of Zuckerberg is trying to, not trying, they have substantially coordinated with Netanyahu to muzzle freedom of speech. I was kicked out of Facebook. Many others have. Purely for solely before advocating for Palestinians. But we were not going to be intimidated. The fight is worth it. And it will be victorious. There were Crusaders' kingdoms that lasted in our region. My father is from the city of Tyre. There was a kingdom that lasted for 200 years. Eventually, they withered away. The people are insisting on their liberation, on the restoration of justice and freedom. It will happen. And with all due respect to all your effort, which are laudatory and admirable, it will happen by the sacrifices of people over there. The least we can do while living here is to give power to their voices, to to tell their story that is banned from mainstream media, from popular culture. All the facts of history are on our side. For that reason, they fabricate, they lie, they concoct, they distort, because they don't have the facts on their side. That's why they freak out when a course on Palestine is introduced on college campus. They don't want the new generation to know, but they know. Gaza has been a great teaching tool for the new generation of people around the world. It's changing. I have been living in Monterey for the last 4 years. Last year, and as you know, people with very high income live there. I was driving my car last year, and I started hearing sounds like people protesting. I couldn't believe it. Never seen a protest in Monterey. I came close to the sound, and I see a gathering of people, mostly retired executive and so on, and they were chanting from the river to the sea. I couldn't believe what I was watching. Obviously, I parked my car and I joined them. But I never thought I would see that. It's happening all around the United States. It will grow. I was in Italy last March. Same thing. It was only more massive in Italy, more massive. It's happening in many places in Western Europe. Palestinian narrative is here to stay. No amount of censorship and repression will ban it. We will not allow it. The task today is to continue highlighting the suffering of Palestinians and also their heroic stories of standing up since the 1930s against a savage and brutal enemy. First the Zionist gangs, and later the genocidal apartheid state of Israel, which was the closest ally of white minority government of South Africa in the world. Read the book on that by Jane Hunter, among many others. Richard Stevens wrote about that. Those countries were so close, they exchanged information about nuclear weapons. One of them came down. The other one will. In time it will. Of that I am certain. Thank you for listening to me.
Do you have any questions? Do you need a mic or?
I think I can be louder.
You can be
Hear me?
Yeah.
I can hear you.
Okay. What do you have to say to those that believe in a two-state solution? But also, what do you say to those that are still taking a stance of neutrality when we know this is clearly a genocide that is happening? And more recently, with the attacks that we're seeing on Lebanon, what do you have to say to those people?
On the two-state solution, I'm still looking for who are the terrorists, since none of you helped me with that regard. I will find it. Yeah, it's from yesterday. Just like go through and you'll find it. I'm determined to finding it for you. The answer, two-state solution. First of all, it's not a solution, and the idea is not two states. The idea, since it was floated around in the 1970s and unfortunately accepted by the ill-cited Yasser Arafat as a Bantustan, just like under South Africa, where they allowed little entities to be collaborators, run, and to work helping the white minority regime. The two-state solution is exactly that. We've seen it after Oslo. It's not even a state. They want a Bantustan helping the Israeli army and serve as collaborators. And also, you want to tell Palestinians that of all your homeland, historic homeland, we will give you, what, 22% of it? And your task as a non-state will be to protect Israel from Palestinians who want to fight back, to take back their homeland? Absolutely not. And for those who are neutral, yeah, they are neutral on question of morality. There were people who did not issue a voice against Nazi Germany. Those who are not speaking against Zionism are as guilty as those who didn't speak about Nazi Germany or about apartheid South Africa. Terrorism in the Middle East. Bombs in cafes, first used by Zionists in Palestine on March 1937 in Jaffa. Bombs on buses, first used by Zionists in Palestine, August, September 1937. Bombs in marketplaces, first used by Zionists in July 1938 in Haifa. Bombs of hotels, first used by Zionists in July 1946. Bombing of foreign embassies, first used by Zionists in October of 1946. Mining of ambulances, first used by Zionists in October 1946. Letter bomb, first used by Zionists in June 1947. I would have been very unhappy if I didn't find it before the end of the evening. Yes. I said I would have been very unhappy if I didn't find this before the end of the evening. The mic is not working, I think, right?
It should be on. I'll come figure that out.
I don't think it's working. Yeah.
Do we have time for another question?
Absolutely. More than one even. I drove all the way. If any question, I'll answer them.
I wanted you to elaborate more on student protests and why they're vital for the movement and how restricting them is harming the movement.
Right. Well, first of all, I noticed in the student movement last year that many of them were active in schools of wealthy students. I mean, I went to a school of wealthy students at Georgetown University. So my hope for the movement was not absolute, because I feel I wanted the movement to be spreading to more campuses, like working class campuses like our California State University system. But unfortunately, in our system, our students are not privileged, so they have to go to jobs. They don't have the time to encamp and spend several days. They need their income. So I was very aware of the class distinction in that regard. And because the movement was largely by privileged students, I told myself, and I wrote it in Arabic and in English, that I don't think it's going to be as radical as the slogans that they were being chanted. There is no reason why this semester the movement should not have taken off strongly, given the fact that the genocide continues. If last year we were protesting 10, 20,000, now it's over 42,000 by the New York Times count. 42,000 dead in Gaza. And yet it died down. Something is wrong. And for that, I don't ever think that liberation of people in Palestine and elsewhere is going to come through movements in the West. With all my support to such movement in the West, which can lend great support to the causes of oppressed people worldwide. But we should know the limits. But all of you can do your role, your share, by publicizing, highlighting the plight of the Palestinians. Tell people around you the facts. And challenge the racists who want to downplay the death of 42,000 Palestinians because they belong to the wrong race and to the wrong religion. Anybody else? Yes, please. Well, I'm 64 years old. I lived in America since 1983. I have never once cast a ballot in this country, and I never will. I believe this entirely is irrelevant to me. And I always thought, since I came here, and mind you, I'm not a one-issue voter. I care about foreign policy, but I also care about social justice here in America. And on both counts, I never thought the Democratic Party or the Republican Party would address my own concerns. And for that, I never voted. I always told fellow Arabs who used to urge me to vote by saying, I know that the next president will be culprit in another Israeli massacre, and I don't want to ever feel regret about that. And every US president was a culprit, from Obama, everybody, since 1948. For me, I think certainly Arabs should not be part of the process with the Democratic Party. It really has declared itself as a genocide party, and I think that the Green Party should be supported, because Jill Stein have taken very strong stand. 15 years ago, the Green Party asked me to run for the US Senate here in California, and I told them at the time, I don't vote, I'm not going to vote even for myself, so I turned it down. But the Green Party is a good party in comparison, but the system here is very closed. It is designed in such a way, the electoral system, in order to shut out the opportunity for third parties to come in. It's not like Denmark, place like that. I mean, if I lived in Denmark, I may vote. But here, the menu of choices is like, Coke or Pepsi, paper or plastic. What if you're for neither, Democrat or Republican,
There's so much to cover, but I wanted to ask really about cultivating awareness in the Muslim community without it, about things like the Abraham Accords. I was a former student of Hamza Yusuf, his sheikh has been by him, and you find that he gave the religious authority to, the Abraham Accords. He gave the authentic,
right.
Gave the stamp of approval.
Right.
And what I've seen, and part of this is U.S. intelligence, UAE intelligence, all the different normalization. There are groups of us who used to study with him back in the 90s, and we're starting to call it out, because we need to call out this stuff. But a lot of people are afraid to, or, they've been groomed, in a sense, to not speak out against their teachers, but they're teaching differently.
About Hamza Yusuf.
Hamza Yusuf been by a
NATO's
normalization process that, honestly, I don't think a lot of people understand, in many people's opinions, this set the way for the genocide.
Right.
And this is Trump. He was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in January from in Congress, not from the Nobel Commission. But how important is this knowledge, and how do we foster awareness and fight and call people out? We need to be called, tell them we need to call, and unify.
Well, after September 11 and the invasion of Iraq, the United States government really sponsored the emergence of what I call NATO's Islam. They have their own clerics. They have them in Germany. I mean, in Germany, they have a school run by the Minister of Interior, which produces acceptable version of Islam. And Germany, as you know, is an extremely Islamophobic, repressive country. This is a place where we're told this is a Renaissance and liberal Germany. Berlin now bans kufiyas from schools. I mean, I am not unhappy for the West to show its real ugly face. Because as a radical leftist from my times in Lebanon, I never had illusions about what the West is all about. But I knew many people had many illusions about it. I never did, never harbored any of these illusions. The UAE and Saudi Arabia's role is extremely sinister, and it's part of the Israeli Genocide Alliance, make no mistake about it. If you follow Arabic news, Saudi and UAE media are actually indistinguishable from Israeli media. Totally. And they only demonize people who work against Israel, who resist Israel. That's their whole mission. But their sinister influence is spreading beyond the region into America. I have said the other day, and I will repeat it to you, every Arab, every acceptable Arab you see on TV, or cited in the New York Times and the Washington Post, is an Arab with financial ties to Saudi or UAE regimes, some of the most despotic regimes on this earth. America's allies and Israel's allies. They are also tied to America's think tanks. Every time you read think tanks in DC, Atlantic Councils, or Middle East Institute, the Gulf Institute, all of that is getting money from Saudi Arabia and UAE. They control the message in tandem with the Israeli lobby. They work very closely with them. And I think that should be always emphasized. The Abraham Accord was sold to us by the UAE as we are now able, with our close relation with Israel, to curtail any of Israel's violent tendencies. We have seen how much leverage UAE has used for the last year. Anybody else? Please.
Quickly though, it's about the new CSU policies that they have implemented about time, place, and manner. What do you have to say about that? That restricts student activism.
Tell me what more about it.
I wish I knew a little more about
Anybody
it.
knows more about it? Can you email me?
I've only saw a brief thing about it. I'm not too sure how detailed it is, but I'm pretty sure it's about.
I don't want to speak about it without knowing the full details, what has been agreed upon. Because there are now a movement nationwide under the pressure of the federal government to basically instill fear and intimidation on the part of students. Obviously, any attempt in that regard should be rejected. But we are fortunate in the CSU system. I've often said, CSUs have more freedom of speech than so-called elite universities, because the Israeli lobby focus more on that, and we don't have strong Zionist presence. Do you know more about it? Anybody knows more about it? The CSU, please speak.
Yeah, it's basically where they allow, it's a new protocol where they allow certain freedom of speech in certain areas on campus and at certain times. So it's kind of, in a sense, it just ends up discouraging the students.
Okay. Take advantage of those spaces and those times. I mean, whatever they give, we can push the boundaries and use whatever space and time. It's really worth the fight. I was telling Palestinians here before, you know, people often think I'm Palestinians, and I'm not. I have intense emotions for Palestine because I grew up in Lebanon where Palestinians lived in refugee camps. I've been into refugee camps where Palestinians hang keys to their homes in Palestine from which they were evicted by force in 1948. How can I not have any passion? I met the people who lead resistance against Israelis. These are regular people who are motivated by a desire, whether you agree with their tactics or not, but it's all about what Zionism has done. It has radicalized people because of the mass violence inflicted on people.
You have a question right here?
Please.
For everything you've brought this evening, I have one question and one clarification on the CSU policy. One, I would ask, I'm Lisa Oliver. I'm one of the privileged people who get to advise the SPL, and grateful to be here. I'm also a genocide scholar, and I'm Blackfeet, which is a Native American people from the northern plains of the United States. So much of what you're saying is resonating with a United States that learned to have a logic of genocidal violence very, very long time ago. So anything that they say today is unsurprising, no matter how dreadful it is. And so I appreciate your very, very honest declaration of that kind of truth. And I think two things. One, I would ask, because I want to thank you for coming this evening and in this time. I know what it's like to look at and have a sense of genocide or my own ancestors. If you see my grandfather's face, understand that only a couple generations ago my family was fleeing their own homelands, and watching the legacies of those policies carry out in our families over generations. And yours And so that you could come here this evening and be with us. One of the things last year I would ask the students was, are you drinking water? Are you getting some rest? Right? And so I'm just wondering from you how you do the work. How can you come? How do you take care of yourself? And so that maybe all of us, not just the students, but we can be reminded of how to go through these types of treacherous times, which is pretty much always with the empires.
Right. It's very kind of you. Can you hear me now? No? Testing? Yeah. It's very kind of you to ask, but you're absolutely right. It's not easy. It hasn't been easy. Watching it from Lebanon over the summer wasn't easy at all, even though you have more like-minded people over there. And look, there's a personal story. Every one of these leaders that are called terrorist leaders here in America, it's a story about something they experienced themselves from Israel, at the hand of Israel. You know, I knew and I met Josh Habash, the leader of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. That man, in 1948, was a medical student at AUB, and he was kicked out with his family from Palestine to walk to Lebanon. And he witnessed his aunt dying along the way. That radicalized him and changed him. Hassan Nasrallah, who was recently assassinated, who also I have met and interviewed over the years, he also barely survived the 1982 invasion of Lebanon. That's what radicalized them. All these mass violence occurrences by Israel have radicalized Arabs. And do you honestly think that out of the rubble of Gaza are not going to emerge future leaders of radical movements who will take revenge and who will inflict violence on Israelis? And when that happens, they will call them terrorists. And they will call on all one of you to condemn them. When they ask you to condemn October 7, tell them yes, but can you condemn every single day from 1948 until October 7, and then from October 7 until now? If you do that, then I will humor your question. Any other questions? Please.
So I want to talk about the narrative of like grouping Arabs together and saying, well, Arab states have this like inherent responsibility to do something about this, and it kind of absolves Israel of its guilt because it's saying, well, Arab states aren't doing anything, so we'll just do whatever we want. And I want to talk about like this deflection and how Arab states are handling it, especially the fact that a lot of them are accepting Israel and willing to compromise at the expense of the Palestinians.
I mean, whenever you ask you about Arab states, you don't have to get defensive about it. You throw back the question at Westerners, right? I mean, it is the West that arm and support or finance most Arab governments, right? Morocco, Libya, Egypt, Sudan, Jordan, Gulf countries, Oman, UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar. I mean, these are your creations, not ours. I mean, they are the reflection of Western agendas, not Arab agendas. The Arabs are crushed. The other day in Cairo, they tried to protest for Palestine, and they came and clamped down on them. You know, in Saudi Arabia, a woman performing the Hajj, displayed the Palestinian flag, was taken away. I know a Saudi who was taken to prison, still in prison, because he advocated for Palestine on social media. But these are not our governments, these are Western governments. You create them, you support them. I mean, the only one who was honest about that was Trump. He honestly said they wouldn't have existed without America. They need American support. And they arm them against their people. And they arm Israel against our people. So whatever Arabs suffer at the hand of their government or at Israel's hands, it is the responsibility of the United States. And this is what we need to say when they say, why are you picking on Israel? Because that's a new definition of anti-Semitism, right? They say, if you pay particular attention to Israel but not to injustice in Namibia, then you are picking on Israel. No, we're not picking on Israel. But Namibia doesn't get $3.8 billion a year from the United States. Namibia is not getting all these weapons to the tune of $20 billion in 1 year by Biden. For that reason, we are saying Israel, because it's an American responsibility primarily. Okay, any other questions? Please.
Why do we not see any popular political leadership emerging from Palestine other than PLO? And why does resistance look like Hamas and other groups? Sometimes perception is everything.
Well, I mean, first of all, it is up to the Palestinians to pick their own leaders. This is a process that nobody in where the West should participate in. And the PLO is not popular anymore with the Palestinians.
Exactly.
And the reason is because it's become a collaborationist, corrupt mafia in Ramallah working to crush Palestinian resistance. The Palestinians choose freely to support Hamas, just as people in South Lebanon, the Shiites, freely choose Hezbollah as their defender, because the Lebanese army never defends them. If the Lebanese army were to defend people in Lebanon, Hezbollah wouldn't have existed. In 1982, when Israel invaded Lebanon, killed 20,000 Lebanese and Palestinians, the Lebanese army was a bystander, just as the Lebanese army now is a bystander, because it is run by the United States government and is not supplied any weapons that are meaningful. So let us leave the process of selecting Palestinian leaders to the Palestinians. And also you may hear, why can't the Palestinians produce their own Mandelas? Why can't they engage? They tried. From 1948 until the PLO was created in 1964, the Palestinians resorted to largely non-violent resistance. And they were shot. Many Palestinians in the 50s tried to go back to see their farms, and they were shot like pigeons. In 1985, a Palestinian American, very naive, I knew him in Washington, D.C., his name is Mubarak Awad, a Quaker, believed in nonviolence, and he wanted to preach that message to Palestinians. He went to Jerusalem, established a Center for Nonviolence. What happened to Mubarak Awad? You can Google him. Israel accused him of terrorism, kicked him out. They thought his message of nonviolence is terrorism. That's Israel. And you wonder why non-violence doesn't sell among Palestinians? When it has been visited upon you repeatedly since the 1930s? When your death is so casually perpetrated? And when you die, and after you die they call you a terrorist? Any other questions? Please.
I wanted to ask about how people who justify the current genocide, how they constantly go back to October 7th. How you'll say 2,000 people were killed this day.
Right.
A hospital was bombed, and they still go, but October 7th.
Right.
I want to see like your perspective, how long they can.
For every Palestinian act of violence, pick anyone, there are always antecedents of Israeli violence. There are always determining factors of Israeli violence. Acts you hate, acts you don't like by Palestinians, October 7 or any other act, there were always precedents by Israel. You've heard of Munich Olympic Games of 1972. It happened because in the previous months, Israel has been incinerating Palestinians in refugee camps in Lebanon. Palestinians were not engaged in violence before Israel was created. They were living their own lives, cultivating their farms, orchards. Look at pictures of Palestinians before 1948. They were happy people. It's like somebody once asked me, how come there are no Palestinian comedians? Of course there are, but I said, you want the Palestinians, what they went through, to produce comedy for you? Really? Adorno, after the Holocaust, said, there's no poetry after Auschwitz. I mean, okay, thank you all, and take care. Thank you very much.